Hey guys, Will here. So before we start today's video, I just want to quickly apologize if I seem a little bit different or a little bit strange on camera today. I had surgery yesterday on my head. You can see the bandage there to remove some cysts out of my scalp. So I'm still on heavy painkillers and still feeling a little bit worse for wear, but I wanted to get this video done today for you guys nonetheless. But yeah, if I seem a little bit different, that's the reason why. Nothing serious, nothing to worry about. It was just an external thing. They didn't have to go into my brain or anything like that. So I'll be good as gold in a few days. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about these wheelbases that we have in front of us. I know that this has been a long anticipated video, so let's just jump straight into this. So today's video is naturally going to be a bit of a polarizing one. I go into this fully aware that whatever I say, I'm probably going to end up upsetting or having half of you disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. I encourage you to disagree with me and to share your own experience, but we're just going to keep this to the raw facts and my observations based on my personal experience. Now, I want to make one thing clear right from the start here. The best sim racing gear is always going to be the gear that you own. We've established long ago that many of the fastest people in the world of esports sim racing use entry-level gear with the force feedback turned down. And we've established that pedals and a solid cockpit are the most significant factors in developing muscle memory, with muscle memory, of course, being the most important aspect to driving quickly and, more importantly, consistently. So if that sounds weird to you, we have a number of videos that are covering these topics already in detail, and I've linked some of those in the description down below for you guys. Now, the role of a force feedback system is to communicate what's going on with the car, not necessarily as accurately as possible, but in a way that your brain can interpret as efficiently as possible in the absence of other cues that you would normally have in a real car. So G-force, for example, that are missing in the context of a simulation. This is the reason why some of the fastest people in esports swear that less is more when it comes to raw pace. As long as you can feel the things that you need to feel, anything else is unnecessary when it comes to going fast. It can actually end up sort of muddying things and making you slower overall. But of course, raw pace is only a part of the sim racing experience. What many of us seek is the deeper level of immersion that comes with higher end sim racing equipment. And this despite the added complexity it brings in many cases as well. So obviously the more complicated gear you have, the longer it takes to set up, the harder it can be to sort of just jump in and drive. And that is always a consideration as well. Now, this, in my opinion, is what forms the basis of a lot of the arguments that we see within the sim racing community when it comes to hardware. You've got those who are willing to spend the money and put in the time required for a better, albeit more complicated experience. And then on the other side, you've got those who just want to win the race. Guy A with the high-end gear ends up being beaten by Guy B with the low-end gear. And next thing you know, you've got the you wasted your money finger pointies starting to happen. So yeah, I mean, we've all seen that happen. And yeah, I think that really often what gets missed is the point that, spending more money on high-end gear is all about immersion, not necessarily going faster. But the point of a review is to look at the hardware and the overall ownership experience as objectively as possible. So that's what we're going to do here today in this video, in the hope that it will help those who are trying to make a decision on which path to take to feel more confident in your purchasing decision. So today we're looking at the Simucube 2 Pro and Sport alongside the Fanatec DD1 and DD2. We'll be looking at the following as objectively as possible using my experience over the last 4 weeks testing all 4 systems back to back extensively and with over 10 hours on each base, as well as drawing on my extended experience with the DD2 and Simucube 2 Ultimate for some parts of the video as well. It should also be noted that all of the conclusions are based upon the latest drivers and firmware, as well as software available from each manufacturer. And this, of course, does have a very significant impact on the overall experience, as we've seen in previous videos and as we'll discuss later on as well. So I'll be looking at the build quality and reliability, ease of use and initial setup, software, drivers and firmware, the wider ecosystem, including integration with other hardware and software, the force feedback quality, and overall value for money. Both internally and externally, the Simucube 2, I believe, has the edge here. We'll talk about the motors themselves in a little bit more detail later on as we talk about force feedback quality. But while there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the DD1 and DD2, the Simucube 2s have a noticeably more solid and industrial grade look and feel to them, in my opinion at least. Now, feel free to judge this for yourselves, of course. I've linked some videos down below where we actually pulled all of these units apart and showed you the internals. But to my eye, having worked in military specification, electronics manufacturing and repair for the first 7 years of my career, the Simucube 2 units look like something I would expect to see or find installed in an industrial setting, whereas the Fanatec gear is noticeably more commercial grade. Now, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It could perhaps be argued that the Simucube 2 gear is beyond what's required for home use and that it would have perhaps been better better to lower the quality to reduce the overall price for the consumer. But it can't be argued that we see very few cases of people experiencing hardware issues with Simucube 2 products. And I believe that this no expense spared approach is probably the reason. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we move on to reliability in just a moment as well. Now, the standard SQR quick release system that comes with the Simucube 2 is much simpler than that of its Fanatec counterparts, and it does not have any flex or play in it whatsoever. Now, the Fanatec quick release, on the other hand, does have some noticeable flex that we've demonstrated in multiple videos, again linked in the description below for you guys. In my opinion at least, however, this flex isn't really noticeable when driving unless you're specifically paying attention to it. I'm sure some of you guys will disagree with me there. But while simple physics say that some of the fidelity and the force feedback would be lost as a result of any flex in any system, I can't say that I've noticed a difference in the driving experience when using third-party modifications such as the Z-Ring to remove that flex. It just really didn't feel any different to me at all when I was actually, in the heat of the moment, driving a car, racing, and, battling on track. It just didn't really notice it. If we're comparing the two, it should be noted that Fanatec are handling both power and communications via a pin assembly within the quick release mechanism itself, which inherently adds a lot more complexity than what's necessary with the SQR system. While the Fanatec quick release itself obviously has pins that connect to the wheel, to allow infinite rotation of the motor shaft, Fanatec uses inductive coupling to provide wireless power and a specifically designed optical communication system to provide the data connection internally whilst maintaining the ability to free spin. So in the case of the Simucube 2, you have the choice of using a wheel either connected via USB or a battery-powered wheel that connects to the wheelbase via Bluetooth. Now, in theory at least, this should mean that there's less latency when pushing buttons on the Fanatec wheels than with the Simucube wireless wheels. However, I've found that the latency on either system is completely negligible. I really can't notice any discernible difference between the two at all, even though on paper, perhaps the Fanatec has the lower latency. And just to clarify there as well, we are talking about latency on inputs specifically, such as buttons and shifts and things like that. We're not talking about steering inputs at all, because that's obviously handled by the wheelbase itself, not the buttons on the wheel. So reliability wise, personally, in the year now that I've been using a Simucube 2 Ultimate and a Fanatec DD2 interchangeably, I've never experienced any major reliability issues with either of them. The only issues I've ever had are just little glitches with USB connections very occasionally, and that's happened in equal portions with both the Simucube and the Fanatec. So it's not really a competition between the two, at least in my experience. Nor have I experienced any problems whatsoever with any of the bases that I've been testing over the last 4 weeks. So the DD1, the Sport, and the Pro. Now, I do keep my ear very close to the ground when it comes to monitoring various different threads on Facebook groups online, Reddit, and places like that, just to sort of get a feel for what you guys are experiencing in the world outside of my little zone here at Boosted Media. And I can honestly say that I've only ever seen a handful of people report issues with Simucube gear. And in every case that I've seen, at least, Simucube staff have been very quick to respond to that problem and deal with it, whether it be a hardware replacement, which I've only seen maybe twice ever, I think, or just trying to figure out exactly what's happened and set the customer on the right path. On the flip side, however, I can't say the same for Fanatec. There's been quite a number of people reporting issues in the time since the DD1 and DD2 were released, most notably around the OLED display and power supply. Now, we do have to keep in mind, however, that Fanatec do sell a lot more of their units than Simucube do, so it's not really fair to compare the experiences shared online directly as a measure of reliability. We also do have to keep in mind that in general, less people are likely to share their good experiences. And this goes across every single industry that I've ever worked in. Automotive world, it was exactly the same. My wife's business is exactly the same as well. So I think that sometimes, people jump online to sort of gauge what the overall experience is like for the majority of customers. And often what you see online isn't an accurate representation of what's really going on in the wider world. But that said, one thing that I do like in particular about Simucube 2's approach is their simplicity. For example, the wheelbase and power supply are both passively cooled, which eliminates multiple potential sources of failure. Overall, I feel like Simucube have taken a more no expense spared approach to the design of the Simucube 2 Sport and Pro, whereas DD1 and DD2, it's much easier to sort of see where manufacturing costs have been saved in the overall process. However, if the Simucube 2s offered the same level of functionality when it comes to things like the OLED display, I'd imagine that they would end up in the same boat as Fanatec as well, sort of needing to cut costs in certain areas or raise their prices. So this ultimately boils down to whether or not you prefer the additional features or the more industrial construction. Now, this is an area where I see a lot of people arguing in Fanatec's favor, but the truth is, if we're talking just in the context of the wheel and wheelbase and ignoring all the other peripherals, both the Fanatec and Simucube 2 bases are very easy to set up and use. As far as the hardware itself goes, both are almost identical. In fact, you plug in power, you plug in USB, you plug in your e-stop, connect your wheel, and you're pretty much good to go. On the software side, once again, Simucube have a more industrial look and feel with the way the software kind of operates, but both Fanatec and Simucube give you a similar level of access to fine-tuning adjustments these days. In the case of a Simucube, there's only one software package to unzip and run, which is called TrueDrive. You have the ability from within TrueDrive to check for and download updates, and the firmware upgrade process is also very straightforward with a simple installation wizard which guides you through the entire process step by step. In the case of Fanatec, if you want full access to all the features available across their entire ecosystem, then you will need to install both the driver as well as a separate software package called Fanalab. However, once both of these are installed, the experience is pretty similar between Simucube and Fanatec. There are a few additional steps involved when upgrading Fanatec firmware, but this is mostly due to the fact that it's important for the firmware on the base to match that of the wheel and so forth. As Simucube 2 relies entirely on third-party wheels and any firmware upgrades to these are done entirely independently, this also adds a little bit of additional complexity to the process depending on what wheel you have, obviously. Where Fanatec do have an edge when it comes to ease of use, however, is in the consistency between various different sim titles. And we've talked about that when we did our individual reviews of each of these wheelbases. When I switched from my Fanatec Club Sport wheelbase 2.5 to my Simucube 2 Ultimate a year ago now, one of the things I really struggled with was how much the driving experience varied significantly between different games. And as we rely so heavily on muscle memory for speed and consistency, this did make me miss just how easy things were with the Fanatec ecosystem previously. After months of driving with my Simucube 2 Ultimate, it was quite refreshing when I got the DD2 to sort of find that consistency between the titles again. I spent many weeks fine-tuning my force feedback settings, but was never really able to get the Simucube 2 to feel as consistent between the titles as the DD2 felt straight out of the box. And that's been the same experience with the DD1 as well as the Simucube 2 Sport and Pro over the last few weeks. I wish that I could tell you exactly why this is, but the honest truth is I just don't know. Perhaps it's down to the game level integration that we see between Fanatec and developers. Many games these days do come with Fanatec profiles cooked straight in, so as soon as you open the game, it detects what hardware you have connected and just loads the optimum settings by itself, which is really useful. Whereas with Simucube, you do generally have to start from scratch with those settings. Now, the profiles that are cooked into the software as well as available on their website do give you some recommended settings, but you do have to put those in manually and sort of fine tune them. And as I said, I was never sort of really quite able to get it quite as consistent between titles as I was with the Fanatec bases. Now, remember again that this video is just a snapshot in time, and this is an area where I'm sure we will see Simucube catch up over time. As the brand grows and their products become more popular, I don't see any reason why long-term this should be a complication, but it's definitely something that I've experienced over the last year using these products. Now, on the subject of recommended settings, both Simucube and Fanatec do provide suggested profiles for most popular sim titles, and they can be loaded from within their software packages as well. With Simucube, this is done all within the one TrueDrive software package, whereas with Fanatec, this does require the additional Fanalab software to be installed. Now, the best way I can think of to describe Fanatec is they're kind of like the Apple of the sim racing world. With Fanatec, everything is nicely integrated, and provided all of your gear is Fanatec gear, it only requires one USB connection to either your PC or your console to get everything working. Now, this allows everything to be controlled through the one software package as well for added convenience, as well as allowing full control over all of the hardware and software in the one place, meaning a more consistent user experience. And this is very, very important to a lot of people. While Simucube does have a proprietary Bluetooth-based wireless connection, which provides consistency in how third-party wireless wheels are connected, and there is also an accessories port available too for connecting other peripherals. Generally speaking, most people will find themselves using multiple USB ports for connecting various different parts of hardware, such as pedals, shifters, and etc., all requiring their own software and drivers to operate. So rather than with the Fanatec system, provided all your gear is Fanatec, everything sort of just works through the one driver package. Obviously with Simucube, if you've got aftermarket pedals, aftermarket shifters and things like that, you're going to have to load the software for each of those. Now, it would be exactly the same as well if you're using, say, a Fanatec wheelbase and then using HE pedals or some other brand shifter. But yeah, if you keep everything within the one ecosystem, obviously ease of use is benefit in that sense. So when it comes to overall simplicity and ease of use, Fanatec do have the edge in terms of simplicity simply due to the nature of their ecosystem. However, Simucube have laid the groundwork in place with their accessories port as well as their software so that they could easily provide the same level of ease of integration should they ever offer a wider range of products themselves into the future. We've already seen a few products make use of their accessories port, such as Raceworks' new pedals. So I do believe the Simucube 2 ecosystem as a whole is very much in its infancy, and we'll definitely see some big advances there into the future. But as of right now, if you want a direct drive wheel with the simplest plug and play experience and seamless integration with other peripherals, then the Fanatec ecosystem is the obvious choice. And it's worth noting as well, it's the only choice when it comes to native console support as well. So we've already talked about the driving experience in terms of consistency, but what about the actual force feedback quality? As I said when I first fired up my Simucube 2 Ultimate base a year ago now, it's absolutely completely smooth without any hint of cogging or torque ripple, graininess, notchiness, or anything like that. And you know, while that maybe wasn't such a surprise with such an expensive wheelbase, what really did surprise me was that the experience was pretty much exactly the same with the Pro and even the Sport. I expected that there would be some sacrifices in this department when stepping down to wheelbases which cost a fraction as much as the Ultimate do, but this was simply just not the case. All three of the Simucube 2s are the only wheelbases that I've ever used personally that are able to provide this level of smoothness. And while it's mainly noticeable, admittedly, when we're sitting in stationary in the pits, it really does go a long way to providing that overall deeper level of immersion that most people that are spending this kind of money on sim racing gear are craving. When I first fired up my DD2, I was disappointed with the experience that it provided, even when compared with the Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5, and we talked about that in the review of the DD2. But updating to the latest drivers available at the time greatly improved the overall experience. And again, more recently with the 371 drivers from Fanatec, and even more recently still with the 374s that were based upon the 371s, the experience has been transformed once again. So at the time that I reviewed the DD2, the Simucube 2 Ultimate was the only other direct drive wheelbase that I had experience with. And I commented at the time that I wasn't sure if Fanatec could ever close the gap in overall smoothness due to the Outrunner style motor that they're using as opposed to the servo motor being used in the Simucube 2s. However, I have to say that in the years since then, and particularly with the most recent drivers, they really have closed that gap a lot further than I ever thought they would. So perhaps one day they will be able to close that gap entirely just purely based on firmware. I don't know enough about these motors. I'm not an expert in electric motors, so I'm really not sure personally. I can only sort of share my experience. But obviously the overall smoothness is only a small part of the bigger picture. Now, comparing the DD1 and the DD2 directly to each other, it comes purely down to the difference in dynamic range between the two. They otherwise feel absolutely identical to each other. And for that comparison, there's a link above my head for you right now, as well as down in the description. Now, when comparing the Simucube 2 Pro and Sport to each other, the differences were a lot more noticeable, with the main difference I felt at least being the faster response time of the Pro due to the increase in slew rate. And again, for more information on that, to see that review, you can click above my head now, as well as the link in the description. Now, comparing the DD1 to the similarly priced Simucube 2 Sport, the two actually feel quite similar in terms of their overall dynamic range. The DD1 has a holding torque of 15 Newton meters and a peak of 20 Newton meters. The Simucube 2 Sport has a peak torque of 17 Newton meters and seemingly is able to hold this consistently without having any issues with overheating or throttling back. However, the Simucube 2 Sport does have a smoother and overall more responsive feel than the DD1 does. One characteristic present with the DD1 and the DD2 is this sort of mechanical feeling clunk in the force feedback on rapid changes of direction, occasionally when bumping over aggressive curbs as well. Now, I'm not sure exactly what causes this, and I don't believe that it's a mechanical thing, so I feel pretty confident that it will be resolved at some point through firmware updates, but the Simucube 2 Sport simply does provide a more refined driving experience overall in terms of the force feedback quality. The comparison between the DD2 and the Simucube 2 Pro is quite similar as well, but the Simucube 2 Pro does feel quite a bit sharper and more responsive once again by comparison, simply due to the increased slew rate that we discussed earlier. Now, there is one really important caveat here. Earlier, we discussed how the Fanatec bases generally provided a more consistent force feedback feel between the different sims in my experience. And this also became quite significant when comparing the bases against each other directly as well. I found that in the more simcade style titles such as Dirt Rally 2, F1 2019, 2020, Project Cars 2, for example, I was never able to quite get the force feedback dialed in with the Simucube bases to suit my driving style quite like I could with the Fanatec ones. That's not to say that it couldn't be achieved, but I feel like this is probably down to the game level integration that we see with Fanatec that we were talking about earlier. It's a hard thing to describe, exactly, but the detail like road textures were, even though they were a little bit sharper perhaps with the Simucube bases, the way the car and the tire physics translated in those more Simcade style titles just felt a little bit more realistic with the Fanatec bases, despite spending many hours fine tuning things like spring force, damper, static force reduction, and all those kinds of settings that are available in the Simucube 2. The smoothness that I'd enjoyed in titles such as Assetto Corsa Competizione, iRacing, and Assetto Corsa, they translated into a more rubbery and disconnected feeling with the Simucube 2s when we were playing in those more Simcade style titles. But that aside, in my experience, when you're in the heat of the battle, as opposed to intentionally analyzing these little subtle nuances of each, the differences between them seem a lot smaller. Those who regularly watch my content would have seen that I competed quite a few of my normal weekly iRacing races using various different bases over the course of the past month, and not once did my overall pace suffer as a result. Within a few laps of switching between bases, I was always right back where I had been previously in terms of lap times. So I really think that this goes to show that at the end of the day, at the pointy end of sim racing hardware, to a large extent, it really does just come down to nitpicking. When I switched from a Simucube base back to a Fanatec base, it did initially feel a little bit grainy by comparison, but within a few laps, this was forgotten in every single case. However, when I switched from a Fanatec back to a Simucube base, I did find that I missed some of those additional features that the Fanatec bases do offer. Things like the ability to make adjustments to the force feedback from the wheel without having to alt-tab out of the game, or the additional features like rev lights and OLED displays, things like that. Now, one other important consideration is that although the Simucube 2 Sport and DD1, as well as the Pro and DD2 are relatively closely matched in price, third-party wheels for the Simucube platform do tend to cost significantly more than their Fanatec counterparts. One thing that I would love to see is some cheaper wheels made available to suit the Simucube platform, as I think that this may attract a lot more customers over to that ecosystem. And admittedly, the more expensive wheels do tend to be a higher quality, but in my experience, once you're in the Simucube world, the temptation is greater to spend a lot more money than within the Fanatec ecosystem, simply due to the abundance of choice available from so many third-party manufacturers. So having spent well over 40 hours over the past month swapping between these four bases, as well as hundreds and hundreds of hours switching between my Simucube to Ultimate and DD2 prior to that over the course of the last year, what does this all boil down to? So when I drive with a Simucube 2, I can't imagine force feedback feeling any better, particularly when playing in VR. I completely forget that I'm in a simulation. By comparison, when I'm driving with a Fanatec direct drive wheelbase, that slight underlying cogging effect, or grain as it could be described, does serve as a reminder that it's not real. But I do tend to forget about it within a few laps and ultimately enjoy the experience just as much. To that point, I found the same when I drove with the Simagic M10 as well. It was far more notchy and grainy than the Fanatec direct drive wheelbases are, and yet I still forgot within a few laps and just enjoyed the driving experience. And most experiences that I've read online would suggest similar. That's why people always say that the wheelbase that they have is the best one, I think. As much as I'm sure everybody would love me to say that one is straight up better than the other, I really just don't feel that that's the case. Both brands do have their strengths. For me, the Simucube has the edge when it comes to build quality and overall force feedback quality, provided that you are playing a sim that takes full advantage of that. But Fanatec has the edge when it comes to a strongly integrated ecosystem, consistency between different sim titles, which really shouldn't be underestimated if you are jumping between sims regularly, and a wider range of feature-rich wheels available at more affordable prices. Will Fanatec continue to close the gap in terms of the overall driving experience? I believe so. Will the DD1 and the DD2 be able to achieve the same convincing level of smoothness that we enjoyed with the Simucube 2? I'm really not so sure that the Outrunner motor has the same potential that the Simucube servo motors have. Look, I could be completely wrong here though, and I've certainly been proven wrong previously. When I originally reviewed the DD2 almost a year ago now, I honestly didn't think that further firmware updates would be able to refine the feel any further. I thought that it was simply just down to the quality of the motor being used, but You know, that has been well and truly proven wrong. The most recent drivers were a very, very, very significant step forward in terms of the overall refinement. And that really genuinely surprised me, particularly when it comes to direct drive. I think the quality of the filters and algorithms and processing of the data is absolutely critical and just as important as the quality of the construction and the components used. My observation is that Fanatec and Simucube have taken different approaches to quite similar products. Simucube have focused primarily on providing the best quality force feedback possible for a given price point, whereas Fanatec have focused on providing a more feature-rich experience overall. Which is more important? That is entirely subjective. After all, we've already established that at this price point, all we're really gaining is a deeper level of immersion anyway. So what immerses you more in the driving experience? Look, guys, I know that the arguments are always going to continue online, but ultimately, regardless of which path you decide to take, you are going to love it. So my suggestion is, ignore the haters in either camp and just enjoy what you have. They're all great products at the end of the day. And I'm very excited not only to see what future improvements can be made, but what other companies bring to the table in the not too distant future as well. As I mentioned in my recent "Is Now a Bad Time to Buy Sim Racing Gear" video, I get the sense that the competition is about to heat up, which can only be a great thing for the sim racing community. So I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this video series, and thank you once again to Brett from Hybrid Racing Simulations for loaning me the SC2 Sport and Pro to make these videos possible, as well as Fanatec for providing their DD1 and DD2, and Simucube, of course, as well for providing their Ultimate. If you guys have found this video series helpful and would like to help support the work that we do here at Boosted Media, I have provided a link in the description which contains some discount codes as well as affiliate links for various different sim racing brands for you guys to use. And remember, of course, as well to hit that subscribe button and notification bells so you don't miss future videos. Only about 30% of the people watching these videos are actually subscribed to the channel, and subscribing really does help tell YouTube that the content is worth showing to new people in their suggested feed. So that is a massive help. But above all, thank you very much for watching as always, guys, and I will see you again soon. Bye.